NGO sector. Recording in progress, yes. Is the environmental and conservation NGO sector ready to shift power and transform? And really in this session, we're looking to, I guess, initiate that question or open it rather than necessarily answer it in the hour that we have available. Let me shift to my next slide. There we go. My name is Lowly Brown. I'm project manager for the Luc Hoffmann Institute's Future of Conservation NGOs project, and that's an initiative I'll talk a little bit more about during the session. And we want this to be an interactive session, an open session, as the name suggests. So there won't be too much talking from us, and we'll aim to allow around 20 minutes at the end for some discussion. In terms of the session outline, I will begin by talking briefly about why there might be a need to shift power and transform, and where we might begin. I'll hand over to my colleagues, Maria Ines Hernandez and Samira Siddiqui, who are both involved in the Future NGO initiative, and I'll let them introduce themselves later. And they'll talk a little bit about where change is already happening and what it looks like. They'll touch on that. And then we'll welcome Eva Rees, who is Director of Strategy and Global Integration at the Global Green Grants Fund. And Eva has a wealth of experience in the civil society space. She's previously worked for Amnesty International, Civicus, and the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations. And she was Executive Director of Global Green Grants Fund in the UK for several years before moving into her current global role. And Eva will share her perspectives as a grant maker on the relevance of sustained transformative change and the examples she's seen, and her thoughts, I think, a little bit on the sector's readiness for change. So starting to address that question that we're asking. And then we'll hand it over to the room. See lots of you joining, which is really great. And I hope we'll have some time for some thought-provoking discussion at the end. So if that's all good, let's get started. There we go. So yes, before we delve into the sector's readiness for change, we wanted to touch on the case for change. Why might there be a need for change in the environmental and conservation NGO sector? And as people attending this Ringo Learning Festival, and especially if you were at the opening session yesterday, these issues likely will not be new. But let's recap slightly. Biodiversity is being lost at an alarming rate. So according to the latest Living Planet report from WWF, which came out last month, wildlife populations have declined by more than 69% since 1970. And this, of course, is a dual crisis with climate change. They're two sides of the same coin. To quote the same report, unless we limit warming to 1.5 degrees, climate change is likely to become the dominant cause of biodiversity loss in the coming decades. And these issues, of course, confront the whole NGO sector, the whole world. But it's a particular challenge for environmental and conservation NGOs because it is their mission to protect life on Earth. And yet, despite their decades-long efforts and many successes, however you judge success from your own perspective, conservation and environmental NGOs in their current form have not managed to significantly slow these crises, let alone halt or reverse them. And of course, there are other factors at play: dominant capitalist society, the need to feed the planet, shifting social expectations, global power asymmetries. These are all affecting the work of conservation and environmental NGOs. But to put it bluntly and admittedly very briefly, as things stand, the sector is failing in its mission to protect life on Earth. Not the most cheery start to the evening, I'm sorry to say. And then alongside these dual crises, we are also living in times of unprecedented speed and pace of change. So an interaction survey you can see on the screen showed that 97% of executive officers from its member organisations thought that the ecosystem in which NGOs operate would be changing either faster, significantly faster, or at an unprecedented rate over the next 10 years. And anyone following politics in the UK over the last few weeks will have experience the accelerated rate at which politics moves these days. For NGOs, it could be digital transformation or keeping pace with the news and communications agenda, or responding to those changes in societal norms or perceptions. Whatever it is, there seems little doubt that in order to keep up, NGOs need to adapt and keep pace with that unprecedented rate of change. And then finally, in terms of the case for change, there are other criticisms and questions being raised of NGOs. Nana, in her opening words yesterday, talked about gender, about race, about power dynamics, and conservation and environmental NGOs, just like their humanitarian counterparts, have come under increasing criticism and pressure. Questions about their organisational culture, their colonial legacy, how they potentially exacerbate power inequalities between the global north and what's often called the global south. And there are also questions about how fit for purpose the existing funding models and project-based models are. These quotes on the screen are from some of the people we've engaged with through the Future of Conservation NGOs project, and they go some way to illustrating those issues. So conservation is not an NGO's only business. There's a need to embrace a broader diversity of views and experiences. Conservation of biodiversity has been Western-led, but it needs to be much more community-led, with voices from Africa, Asia, South America weighing in and leading a new vision. And there's a need for more local, equally distributed and unrestricted funding to switch the donor-recipient model to a partnership model. So from our perspective at the Future of Conservation NGOs initiative, there is a shift happening in and around conservation and environmental NGOs, and the time is ripe for radical transformative change, to ask ourselves, is this truly the best way we can collectively deploy our energies? Have we relied too much on NGOs as the main architecture for addressing these issues? Do we still believe in this model, and that this model in its current form is able to respond to the complexity of problems we face? That's our perspective and the questions that we've been asking ourselves through this project. But this session is about the wider sector's readiness for change. So we want to hear your perspectives about that appetite and need for change. So to do that, we are going to ask you to fill out a very quick and non-scientific poll. If you can go to the link shown on the screen, or I think also pasted in the chat, you should see 3 questions to answer. Don't spend hours. If you can give a quick reaction to those, that would be great. And in the meantime, I will stop sharing this and attempt to share the results. Okay. I can see some answers coming in. I'm going to go back to the screen share and hope that you can see that. Can you see those answers on my screen coming in? Give me a nod. Yeah, I see a few nods.
Yeah, we can see them.
Great. Let's give it a few more minutes, or a few more seconds maybe. Don't know if I need to refresh. Let's see. Or if everybody has done it. Yeah, okay. Thank you for voting. It seems, perhaps unsurprisingly, given the audience, that there is a bit of a consensus, in this room at least, that there are areas in which the sector could do better, maybe slightly better at identifying inequalities, less good at keeping pace with that change that I talked about. And this is just indicative, of course, and I hope later what we can do is delve more into the views in this room on whether this consensus about the need for change and the areas in which we could do better is shared, whether it's shared more widely across the sector, rather than just the people who sign up to and attend the Ringo Learning Festival. Okay, let me go back to my slides. Just to say, we'll put the results of this when we share the slides as well, if you're interested in looking at them more widely, it's obviously not scientific, but a useful indicator, I think, that in this room at least, there is a bit of an emerging consensus. Let me go back to the slides. So assuming there is that emerging consensus on the need for change and putting aside the readiness for change for a moment, where might we begin on that journey towards change? That is part of what we've been examining through the Future of Conservation NGOs initiative. And we've been on a journey that's similar to the Ringo journey, focused, of course, mainly on conservation. We've been asking ourselves, how might we reimagine a new conservation model that leads us towards more transformative, just, inclusive, diverse, and sustainable future for life on Earth? We've had 3 phases of the project. We started with a discover and reimagine phase, looking at what and how to transform. We moved on to a development phase where we sought to identify some alternatives. And we've just embarked on a delivery phase where we're testing and implementing those alternative ideas and sharing the learnings. In our discover and reimagine phase, we looked at what and how to transform. And during that phase, we engaged with hundreds of people, not just from within conservation, but more widely, youth groups, justice groups, the media, philanthropists, conservationists, private sector corporations, and so on, seeking their views on whether there is that need to change and where we might begin. And really through that process of discovery, we heard pretty strongly that there is an appetite for change within that selected group that we spoke to, and that the issues that have surfaced more widely within the NGO sector also exist and need to be addressed in the environmental and conservation NGO sector too. And 4 broad but dominant and recurring themes emerged, which we felt we saw were impacting conservation effectiveness. And these have provided us with a guide to where change is most needed. And again, these have big parallels with the Ringo areas of stuckness. If you're familiar with them, there are lots and lots of similarities there. And just briefly, the themes we identified were power and legacy there at the bottom, the roots. And this is the need to dismantle racist and discriminatory structures, decolonize conservation practices. Then we have interdependence and inclusivity, and that's about the need to embrace this more inclusive approach, collaborate, engage with a diverse range of actors, and also embrace planetary health, so the health of humans, of ecosystems, of biodiversity alongside one another in order to protect life on Earth. Then communications and narratives, that's about challenging dominant global north narratives, embracing different plural voices and knowledge. And then finally, at the top of the tree there, we have operational and funding models. So that's about redesigning those operational, financial, governance models that currently exist to ensure they're fit for purpose. So that's where we at the Luc Hoffmann Institute at the Future of Conservation NGOs initiative have started. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Ines now to talk a little bit about where change is happening within these areas. Ines, shall I continue with the slides? I think
that would be super helpful. Thank you.
I know when to move them on.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Leonie, for that not super exciting introduction, but also quite exciting if we get proactive. My name is Maria Inés Hernandez. I work as Diversity, Inclusivity, and Research Coordinator for the Future of the Conservation NGOs project at the Luc Hoffmann Institute. I am from Mexico City, and I'm looking forward to move this presentation into a discussion where we can hear a bit more about all of us and our perspectives. But as Leonie said, until now we have talked basically about the need to shift power and transform. What is our problem statement? Why do we need to change? Do we need to change? And Leonie has shared a bit of her journey with the Future of Conservation NGOs. And we're, sorry, my computer just, I'm really sorry. There we go. Leonie has shared a bit of her journey with the Future of Conservation NGOs, where we ask ourselves, where can we begin with the transformative change? And as she covered, we identified key themes where change is more needed. And having doing this, we moved to the next question of our project, which was tackling basically this question: where is transformation change happening in the sector? And to respond to this, what we did basically was to launch an innovation challenge. So next slide, please. So last April, in partnership with the IUCN Commission on Environmental, Economic and Social Policy, IUCN CISP, and Impact Hub, we launched a global challenge to drive innovation and support solutions that can proactively address these deep-rooted issues that are facing conservation NGOs, and that can help build these futures for a more just, inclusive, and regenerative way of living on Earth. So we were basically seeking for radical ideas for transformative change, particularly in the 4 themes identified by the project that Leonie just presented. We made a call for submissions. These were open from anyone, from any sector, experience, background, age, as long as the project had a vision for the future of conservation practices and an idea that can challenge the existing approaches, structures, and narratives that are, well, at the moment, adversely impacting conservation effectiveness and also social and environmental justice. We welcomed also concepts at all stages of development, from ideation through prototyping and beginning to scale. And again, the main quest was to seek for problem solvers using innovative methodologies and methodologies that address these deep-rooted issues, so seeking radical change that can bring together solutions. Something important to mention is that we did not understand innovation, and as we do not understand it right now, as something new, acknowledging that sometimes the most radical would be to go back to practices that are everything but new, that have been happening for ages or millennia. So we rather refer to innovation as new ways of doing things, new ways of thinking, relating, implementing, sharing, learning, understanding, and overall new ways of building futures for life. So these certainly included new ways of mainstreaming successful and already existing conservation practices. Next slide, please. So one of the first insights we had after the application period is that change is happening, and there is a will for change. There are radical ideas for transformative change in conservation NGOs. So as you can see in this slide, we received a total of 173 applications from 58 different countries. I must say we received much more applications than expected. We were quite thrilled, and it was such an exciting process to just read all of these and see that change is happening. Most of the applications we received were from Africa, followed by Latin America and Asia, as you can see on the slide. And in general terms, more applications from the so-called global South or global majority, or at least from Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Most applications we received were at the prototyping stage with 40%, followed by 39 at the ideation stage. So some are ideas and creative processes, some others are already at a prototyping stage. And in terms of gender, just as an interesting insight, we received 56% of the applicants were male and 41% female, with one being non-binary, 1%. Next slide, thank you, Leonie. So we selected 9. It was really hard, but we selected 9 with a board of juries from different backgrounds and geographies. We selected 9 innovative ideas that were challenging dominant conservation narratives, that are redesigning conservation approaches, and that reimagining overall the conservation space. The winners received 5,000 euros in prize money and a place in a tailored co-learning program with one of the 3 partners. It is very important for us to mention that this is a co-learning program in which hopefully the process is done horizontally. We have already started this program and it's with the host institution, so Luc Hoffmann, IUCN CISP and Impact Hub, and we're working alongside the selected ideas to take the ideas to the next level of implementation or testing. Next slide, please, Leonie. Here you can see half of the ideas. On the other slide, we're going to hear about some others. But as you can see, the selected ideas represent a wide array of conservation efforts, international, local, rural, urban, from coastal communities in the Maldives to urban population in Greece. I'm going to go over them quite fast, but to give you an idea, we have Human Nature working in the UK and Kenya. It's a project that aims to equip NGOs with tools to communicate in non-conflictive ways, to collaborate and engage more effectively with a diversity of voices. We have in Gabon, Gabon Women's Platform, an inter-community platform that supports rural women across Gabonese villages. And they're also building a platform for solidarity among these women towards conservation results. We have Empowering Women Through Ocean Opportunities in the Maldives, which is a very exciting project, empowering women and girls through snorkeling and swimming towards conservation work or conservation passion. We have Kaiklos in Greece, working in circle neighborhood and circular economies in urban spaces. In Australia, we have Bula Bula, working with regenerative agriculture that centers indigenous peoples, especially women and youth. As you can see, we have a bit of the symbols of the 4 themes of change in all of the ideas, but most of them are not only tackling one, one or two, but even 3 of the 4 key themes for change. Next slide, please, Leonie. Here you can see some of the ideas. We have 2 members of 2 of these ideas in the call. Hi, Gal. Hi, Samira. We have Heritage for Health, a project that aims to catalyze systems change by enabling community-driven rangeland restoration in Mozambique, Botswana, and Zambia. We have Young Stewards of Migratory Birds Ecosystem working in Venezuela. The project aims to build more just and futures by motivating young people to protect different ecosystems with migrating birds. And Gal, I'm sorry to introduce your project, but we have Rewildo that is based in the UK. And this project aims to use blockchain-based social concepts of DAOs and to enable collective decision-making in, as said by the team, self-tailored, transparent, and non-hierarchical manners. As you can see, I haven't presented Project Invisibility, and that is because I am now excited to hand it over to Samira from Project Invisibility, one of the selected ideas, as you can see, and well, I will let them introduce themselves and present their project, and thank you for your time.
Hi everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. Thank you, Leonie and Ines, for the presentation. So I'm Samira Siddiqui. I'm based in Berlin via England and Pakistan. I've been seeing where people have been coming in from in the chat. By training, I'm a marine biologist with a background in environmental and social justice and the arts and activism. And I work for Global Diversity Foundation and Project Myopia. And we're one of the awardees of the Innovation Challenge for our idea, which is named Project Invisibility. So through the Innovation Challenge Incubation Program, Project Invisibility marries and builds from our combined experiences of Project Myopia and the Global Diversity Foundation, and we bring them together. And to create transformative change, we go straight to the site of dominant knowledge production, which is the university classroom. So I'll start off by telling you a bit about Project Myopia. We diversify university curricula through crowdsourcing material directly from students. So that revolutionizes the way that curricula are designed. So students write in with the material that they want to see. And we want to see more work from the global majority that increases diversity. So that's more work from women, LGBTQ people, non-binary people, disabled people, and people around the world. And over the past 5 years, we've seen a direct impact in the universities that we work with in pedagogical practices and improving aspects from student welfare, with students being able to see themselves in the classroom, to participatory methods of decolonizing the curriculum from the grassroots up. And at Global Diversity Foundation, we work with environmental change makers to help communities and environments flourish. And the way we do that is we offer social and environmental change makers the network and the resources that are needed to achieve durable solutions to our contemporary planetary challenges. We have a network called the Global Environments Network, which has over 600 environmental change makers from across 85 countries, and they are all working at the front lines of environmental change. And we offer them mentorship, incubation, generating case studies and toolkits, sharing stories of transformation and practical experiences to bring courage and inspiration to change makers around the world. We have field programs and practice as well in the High Atlas of Morocco, which is the site of our current long-term cultural landscapes field program. And we work with Amazigh communities on revitalizing traditional practices, sustaining livelihoods, and restoring nature. So what Project Invisibility does is uses the power of storytelling to bring these two organizations together to build a just and equitable future. And we do that through, rather than being a voice for the voiceless, we intend to pass the mic to the unheard. We will crowdsource, document, and disseminate voices from the forefront of social and ecological justice in the locations which are the most impacted by these challenges. And over time, we will collectively shift the dominant narratives in the conservation discourses within academia and the NGOs. And eventually, this will result in change in the communities and landscapes. So the platform will mainstream the alternative narratives and break down these silos that we see in academia, and leading to richer and more nuanced understandings of conservation in practice, which is rooted in local realities rather than in Western imaginations. So I can share more links about our work in the chat, and would love to connect with you. Please, I look forward to the dialogue and the Q&A after this as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Samira, for bringing much more depth into how this change is happening, particularly in Project Invisibility, Myopia, and Global Diversity Foundation. It's quite exciting to hear from the work you're doing. And as we're on that note, hearing from experiences from the field and spaces where change is already happening, I'm now handing it over to Eva Rees from Global Green Grants to hear a bit more about the relevance of sustained transformative change and whether or not the sector is ready to embrace this change. So with this huge question, Eva, I now hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be part of this conversation. As Leonie said, I've worked on these issues for a number of years, and one of the big gaps that I've always seen is the environmental and conservation sector engaging in this. So to see that kind of engagement, I really applaud it. I'm very happy to be here. So I work for Global Green Grants Fund, which is a participatory grant maker. And so our model is built on decentralizing decision-making to grassroots actors. That means that we're constantly learning about power, agency, intersectional systemic change, local leadership, and really having this dialogue with others is so valuable there. So I'm going to speak a bit from the grant maker perspective and what I'm seeing in the funding space, but also really as an individual grappling with a lot of these questions. And I basically have 3 questions for you that I'm also asking myself, and I'm doing the speaker thing where I ask more questions than I give answers, but I hope that we can get through that quickly and then actually discuss them. So my first question to you is, why do you engage in conservation? What view of the earth do you have? What is your view of your role within it? What does your motivation reflect in terms of your worldview as an individual, but also as the organization that you represent? Now, why am I asking this? I would say that we cannot transform our sector and work in any meaningful way on change if we don't start within ourselves as individuals. We need to understand the systems that we uphold within ourselves, often deeply subconsciously, and how this reflects in our worldviews and our approach to our work. And I'm also saying that because certainly from where I'm standing, it's clear that we can't have siloed single lens approaches in conservation and environmental protections, because the issues that we're trying to address are not siloed. They're deeply systemic and connected. We can't silo environmental issues from social justice issues, for example. And I see in the pilots, in the projects that you shared, that that's very clearly coming out, that the same systems that oppress Earth also oppress us as people. They're inherently exploitative. They're racist. They're built on the supremacy of whiteness and patriarchy. So if we kind of start from there and we agree that we need solutions that embrace that complexity and that nuance of this world in which we live and work, so understanding these underlying systems that perpetuate the extraction of nature and humanity, what does that change about our personal worldview and motivation to engage in this work? I think the problem is that we're generally not in the business of telling stories of such complexity and nuance to ourselves and also to others. So my second question is, what if our strategies and our stories embrace those complexities that exist inside us and in our systems? So for example, the story that sometimes to protect an ecosystem, we have to prioritize the leadership and the livelihoods of the people living within it with their own knowledge and their own strategies. And that may seem counter to our understanding of conservation. The story that scale and growth is the solution to everything. You know, what if we tell the story that diversity, equity, inclusivity in thinking, in lived and learned experience, in our approaches is not just an add-on, it's actually the only way to effect sustained transformative change. So what systems do we perpetuate by not examining these questions seriously? I told you I would have a lot of questions. My experience is that this as a whole is still pretty surprising in the environmental funding space as a conversation. It's unspoken. It's unspoken that racism and neocolonial thinking in conservation exists. And I would say that's because, in part, because NGOs don't necessarily talk to funders about this. It's not that it's systemically suppressed as a conversation, but it's not transparent either. And the voices who raise this are in the margins. They're not in the center of the sector. And what's happening on the other side is that there is movement in the funder space. There is interest from environmental funders to fund different, more complex solutions. There's interest in justice, in equity, in inclusivity, in conservation. I would say the language of decolonization is still very difficult, but shift the power as a movement is definitely taking hold, and we see shifts in funding models and practices. And here's where I see a problem, because I don't think that this discourse should only or primarily be shaped by donors. It needs to be shaped by the needs of civil society, by the people working within this sector. And so NGOs are really important conduits of this work. And I see that conservation NGOs have often struggled with this internally without kind of going into community. And unlike the humanitarian sector, we've not had a major whistleblowing scandal. And I'm wondering why that is. Is that because we don't see the problem? Or is it because we're caught up in these funding and narrative models that force us to perpetuate and uphold these narratives of impact, of accountability, of scale, of success, of failure? So there is definitely a role for donors to play a part, to signal need for different discourse, to shift practices, to support local leadership, to press NGOs for greater partnership, and also to reassess the added value to local communities. But I just want to stress again that I don't think that this change is going to happen if it's driven by donors. And there's also a lot that philanthropy has to sort out within itself too. But as long as we don't examine these questions and starting from an individual perspective, from this inner work, then I don't think we can successfully tackle those systemic challenges as individuals and also as organizations. And that's not one-off work. That's perhaps slower than the urgency of the moment that we heard about, but it's also a lifelong commitment that we need to sustain. And we've seen that change is happening. So my third and last question to you is, what would change if you shaped this story of your own learning and unlearning together with this community here of practitioners and in thought partnership with your donors? And as I was writing this, I thought, well, actually, in other words, it's just a massive plug to engage in Ringo and the Future of Conservation NGOs project. So I'd love to hear some thoughts on all of these questions from everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. Thank you, Samira and Ines as well. Yeah, some really thought-provoking stuff there, right? Yeah, I found it really interesting what you're saying about this won't happen if it's driven by donors. It has to come from somewhere else. And NGOs actually can play that conduit role. As part of our project, we produced a report on what the future role of conservation NGOs might be. And that was kind of in there, maybe not so explicit, but But yeah, what role do they play in the future? If they're shifting and transforming, what is it into? Really interesting stuff. I wonder if in the room there is any initial reaction to what Eva said, any answers to those very difficult questions that she posed us. Please do feel free to speak up or in the chats. Deborah, I see you have a hand raised.
Yeah, I just wonder if we can stop sharing the screen so I can see everyone. Would that be all right?
Nice, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'll lower my hand. So I'm glad. I know it's such a small group. It's late in the day, but you know, as you know, the folks from Luc Hoffmann, and I'm glad there's a couple of people here from the conservation sector. It's been really difficult in Ringo. Ringo was envisaged to have environment, development, human rights, humanitarian, peace building, all the sectors. We got a couple of environmental groups. They've sort of drifted, gone off to do a few of their own things. But the conversation definitely isn't as wide and as deep. You know, we've got 900 people, over 900 people registered in Ringo. I'm not sure how many of them come from the conservation sector. I have to look at the numbers, but my hypothesis is not many. And so I guess I'm going to ask another question to people as to how do we engage the conservation sector more rapidly and deeply on the shift to power conversation. I used to work in the sector, and it's still, you know, very much dominated by white male saviors, quite frankly, if you don't mind my saying it that way. So I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that.
Anyone who wants to contribute thoughts there? Ines, go ahead.
I guess this may be just a reaction, but with the spirit to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, as you were saying, Eva, and getting the conversation going. My first reaction is, what do we mean when we say the sector is driven by white men? Like, what does it mean to drive the sector? Who is actually doing conservation right now? It's also a question about that. Like, why don't we look differently at who is actually right now doing the conservation work? Because there's communities, ways of living that are what we could understand as conservation, and that has been happening for ages, and now it's happening even as a resistance. So why don't we change the way we see who is driving the sector, or the way we see the sector as a whole? So that's just a first reaction.
Thank you, Ines. And I also wonder if Eva talked about the lack of a whistleblowing scandal in the sector. Perhaps that's just luck, quite frankly. And if there was a whistleblowing scandal, it would be driven, that leadership would be more driven to embrace the change that is already happening in other parts of the sector. It could also be, as Eva was saying, that we're actually caught up in these impact narratives that may or may not be useful. But it's my hunch, I guess, from having worked in the humanitarian sector and now in the environmental and conservation sector, that actually if there was that kind of scandal, it pushes you forward a little bit. Not that I want there to be, but it can really drive impetus towards change. Samira, why didn't you come in? Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. A couple of thoughts bubbling, and the first is of what Ines said, like, how can we revisualize who's on the front line? And it, you know, most often it ends up being women, mothers who are at the front line, and they're not reflected anywhere else. And with the power imbalance and the absence of these voices, both Project Myopia, Project Invisibility, those were driven by some of my experiences and the experiences of my colleagues on the absence of those voices in the university classroom. So that there's a cycle of where knowledge is being produced and an erasure of the voices from the front line, which then ends up going into the INGO world, which tend to hire individuals, probably like many of us in this room, with masters and PhDs, access to higher education, access to passports and freedom of movement. These are some of the power imbalances that need to be addressed. And when it comes to a whistleblowing or some kind of scandal, frankly, there's, in my experience, several things I've witnessed in conservation NGOs, which I would say qualifies as absolutely scandalous. So, for example, conservation NGOs which ended up perpetuating fortress conservation and actually physically harming frontline environmental defenders and indigenous people who were in their communities. And there's this comes from experience working in a project on illegal wildlife trade, which was funded by the United States from US aid. And I realized later that it was actually a cycle of criminalizing and creating an arms conflict in fortress conservation. So there have been these scandals, but it depends on if people think of them as scandalous or as necessary. And that comes from what the perception of conservation is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're so right. It depends on what the public perception of those scandals is, not how scandalous they are as a fundamental. You know, the scandals that engulfed Save the Children and Oxfam just hit the media headlines, especially where I was in the UK at the time, and it just hasn't been the same. It doesn't mean that those scandals don't exist. They absolutely do. And but they just haven't been as widely reported. And therefore, within the sector, and I'm not saying this is the right thing, but within the sector, they don't provide the same drive towards change. Peter, I see you have a hand raised. Hi, good evening.
Hello, thank you. I'm Peter. I work with Well Grounded, focused on the Congo Basin. And the point I wanted just to sort of reflect on was that's been raised already is around voice. I realize I'm sitting here as a white middle-class man, and I'm a voice in a room, but actually the voice that I wanted to talk about wasn't that one. It was actually the voice of organizations who are doing really good environmental work, but we just don't really know as much about that as I think we could do on a wider stage. And I guess the arena I'm thinking about is the Congo Basin, which had got all sorts of other challenges going on apart from the environmental challenge. There's conflict and there's health issues in Cameroon, Congo Brazzaville, and those regions. And I think that being a conduit for the voices of the leaders of those community-based organizations is a real role that NGOs, INGOs can play, I think, in enabling resources to get channeled in those directions. So they can amplify what they're doing. I think that's a real missing component. And particularly, I mean, our experience of Well Grounded, we feel as though the Francophone world is particularly in a different place to the Anglophone world in terms of natural resource management and climate protection issues. I realize Congo Basin as a whole is well known as, the second largest tropical forest in the world and those sort of statistics around it, but it feels as if whilst there's interest, it's not always backed up by the ability to support the leadership and support the development of organizations to do what they do best in those areas as much as other areas.
I think it's interesting what you say about that role that NGOs could play. I wonder, Eva, if you've got thoughts on that from a kind of funders or grant makers perspective, like how open are funders to those new types of roles that in the future NGOs, conservation and environmental NGOs might play? Is that something that's fundable, attractive to funders? You talked a bit about there being a little bit of appetite there, but what's the perspective?
I think it's so emerging in the environmental space, right? We've seen much more movement, I'd say, in the human rights and social justice space and development funding space to have the conversation around what's the added value. If you prioritize local knowledge and leadership and you want to foster this as a funder, what's the added value of an NGO, an international NGO in that mix? And then there are some real practical challenges that funders have of moving money to grassroots communities or even local NGOs. They perceive that to be a much larger risk than maybe it is in reality. There might be legal implications for them, and so that's where in this ecosystem of funding, intermediary funds like green grants have really come in and helped with that, but we're not necessarily facilitating the conversation with the NGOs in that space. We're just trying to work with funders to channel money, and money moves strategy also, right? We know that, and money can foster leadership. I think that we're missing these really important aspects that I talked about, that inner work, that sort of understanding the underpinning systems. If we just go with let's shift money away from INGOs to local communities. And I was just typing in the chat, one of the strategies that we're working on in the funding space is to actually help the creation of, let's call them Global South funds that are led by Global South leaders, are funding communities and NGOs, important infrastructure NGOs that exist at national and regional level. And again, I see a disconnect because I don't necessarily see INGOs being big voices in that creation. And INGOs are often funders, right? Let's also be clear on that. They often have their own funding schemes going that are really important for grassroots communities. So I do think there is so much need for dialogue, and I hear funders wanting that dialogue and not necessarily getting that's why I was harping on about the narratives, right? Not necessarily getting that nuance or complexity in conversation with grantees. And that's not an individual organization's fault. That's the system, the funding system that we all operate in, which is why I think it's so great that one of your 4 areas is actually looking at funding models, because I do think that if we can collectively shape them in a way that speak to the needs of NGOs, activists, communities, then I think we can really affect that systemic change. It's not going to happen if we just all individually sort of pull in our respective levers.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, harping on about the narratives, I wouldn't describe you as harping on, but I wonder if Samira wants to come in there, because that's kind of the work that you guys are doing, right? Is starting on that inner work, trying to change those narratives, starting with academia. But I don't know, have you thought about widening that out to funders, and what's your kind of perspective on where we start with that inner work?
Wow, that's a great question. So the work we do is we're driven by our network members, and they're the ones who all of our programs are for. So the work we do is a direct result of what is for by them. And the ways that we've been doing that recently is through a mentorship program, which is specifically on developing fundraising proposals, and as being a conduit and an ally and an advocate to be able to channel funds to community-based organizations. So that's one of the ways. And another thing that we do is bring people together, try and get as much interconnection from around the world. So this year we had the Global Environment Summer Academy, which was our 7th. And we brought, every time it happens, we bring 20 environmentalists from around the world together. And there's a lot of interdisciplinary learning. And this year, this was the first one we had post-COVID. And I just want to share one of the challenges, which was another example of how power imbalances remain. And the challenge was visas. So we had our event in the UK with the University of Oxford. And 6 of our participants out of 20 were not able to get visas, and they all predominantly came from countries in Western Africa, so Nigeria, Cameroon, and North Africa as well, Algeria. And to us, that was just more evidence of how access to knowledge and power is just not even possible. So we have one participant from Benin. In Benin, there isn't even an embassy or somewhere that you can go to get a visa. So it's kind of saying, don't even think about it. So going back to the positives, the bringing people together is one of the ways that we work on the inner work and practice decolonizing.
Okay, thank you. And it kind of strikes me that, yeah, we're a small group here. It's late in the day where I am, at least. But, you know, we're all here because we're interested in this change. We want to see it happen. We're passionate about it. But actually, the question we initially posed with this session is the sector ready to shift power and transform? And there's lots of different aspects of readiness, right? Having the tools, having the appetite. I wonder, in terms of the appetite, is that something you see within your organizations? You know, we spoke to 200 or so people as part of our project, and we felt this appetite for change, but actually, even though it's 200 people, it's still a bit of an echo chamber, because we're reaching out to the people that we know, and the people who are interested in talking to us about it are people who have something to say about it. So actually, more widely in your organizations, I wonder if anyone has anything to reflect on whether that appetite and recognition that change is necessary is there.
I can probably chime in, even though I'm probably a little bit, from working at the Luc Hoffmann Institute, I'm exposed to it maybe a little bit more. But I've made a comment earlier on in the sense that the first published papers regarding like colonial, Western white powers being too heavily involved in conservation started in the 80s. So the issue has been there and has been spoken about for a long time. Now, I didn't really see it, and to put context into that, like the past, say, 2 or 3 years, it's definitely ramped up, like without a shadow of a doubt. Not simply just because I've been exposed to it at the Luc Hoffmann Institute, but I see it a lot more. Whereas back in 2013, when I was working in conservation, I didn't see it ever. Is it enough to really make change? I don't know. Like I said, the issue's been there, and we've known about it since the 80s. So who knows what sort of unit of pressure or effort needs to happen, because no one knows what it really is. But yeah, I can't really see it changing slowly. Like the power dynamics that exist are so unbelievably strong, and no one's really quantified them in any real way. I think if it is going to change properly, it will happen suddenly in a big shift. There's to be some sort of utilization of like you say, like we're discussing scandals and stuff earlier on. There has to be like some sort of outside catalyst that gives a degree of momentum that we can latch onto, and then using that, you might see these big shifts happen all of a sudden. But yeah, that's just my take on that. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Andrew, and apologies if my pronunciation's not right, but Kerry or Siri, I see you have a hand raised.
Yes, you can hear me now. It's Kira.
Kira, I'm so sorry. Neither correct.
No worries at all. Yeah, I kind of, coming from an environmental NGO, and a large one based in Cambridge, I thought I'd kind of chip in with my 2 cents on my experience. I've worked there for just 1.5 years now, and before that I studied a master's in conservation. And going back to my studies, it was kind of blindingly apparent how strong and dominant this idea that it's kind of nature first and then kind of social considerations second, and not just in terms of course content, but also just the kind of general sentiment among peers and things like that. And I found that quite striking at the time. So I think there are, you know, massive institutional issues in education still around that. And even if it's changing, it's not changing fast enough. And then in terms of my work at UNEP WCMC, there definitely is a kind of a growing interest and awareness that human rights issues need to be kind of integrated into our project work from the kind of proposal stage. I think for a long time, it's kind of been an afterthought, and you know, more and more, I think NGOs are realizing it's something that has to be integrated from the very get-go. But my feeling is that capacity around that is still very low. And even when kind of guidance is developed on this, it's, you know, the question needs to be asked, are the right people developing this guidance? You know, whose voices are we centering, and whose idea of, you know, this is how we can make our projects more socially just is that coming from? So yeah, I think things are shifting, and I mean, we developed a new strategy for the organization this year, and for the first time ever, there's an initiative dedicated to nature, gender, and human rights. So that kind of reflects that there is change, but I also have the question of, but is it enough to achieve the kind of entire paradigm shift that we do really need? So yeah, that's my 2 cents. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. It's so interesting, isn't it? You know, that readiness for change is not just about appetite, it's about capacity, it's about who's driving it, and so on. I feel like, as usual with these things, the chat just starts to warm up and get interesting just as the session draws to a close. And there are a couple of things I just quickly want to share at the end, but I just want to say thank you so much to Eva and to Samira for joining us. Did either of you want to just have a quick final word? Anything you're burning to say? No, we're good. Okay. Well, I wanted to I'm going to share my screen very quickly because I wanted to let people know, if you're interested in, is that the one? Yes. If you're interested in the work we're doing at the Luc Hoffmann Institute, what you can do to find out more. So we have a very, very quick SurveyMonkey. It won't even take a minute of your time on if you're interested in being involved in it, in what capacity that might be. And of course, to know more, you can visit the website and read our report that we brought out in March, which is called Exploring Possible Futures for Conservation NGOs. Or Innocent, I would love to hear from you directly. Being part of this Ringo Festival is to make more connections, widen that sphere of people we're talking to. So please do get in touch, and I hope you found this session useful and interesting.
Thank you so much, Leonie and team. It was great. I was really looking forward to having part of the Learning Festival, having followed your projects for quite some months already. Just briefly, for anyone who's going to join tomorrow, there's another full day at the Ringo Learning Festival, day 3. Just very quickly, tomorrow is the day to map the change that is needed in the sector. So this really builds on exactly this conversation. We're going to have 4 different sessions around map the change. What can funders do differently? How can we transform leadership and governance in NGOs? How can we revolutionize accountability and measurement? And then lastly, how do we embed solidarity in everything that we do? I think a lot of the topics that we just discussed here as well. I just wanted to mention that. A little advertisement for the sessions tomorrow at the Ringo Learning Festival. We have open space at the beginning, but I think there's currently no session proposed. And then there is a space to meet your peers at the end of the day. So like if you're leading an NGO, meet other NGO leaders. If you're working in a national CSO, meet others. If you're a donor, meet other donors. Thank you very much for organizing this open space, to the Luc Hoffmann Institute and everybody who contributed.
Pleasure. Thank you for having us, and congratulations on all the work that you're doing. It's an inspiration.
Let's inspire each other.
Yeah, exactly. Do click on the SurveyMonkey link, and then you'll have it in your browser. You can fill it out at any time. We'd love to have people's involvement as much as possible.
Great. Thanks.
Super.
Thank you for
I just want to know, Peter, on the Francophone session, if that does interest you, si tu parles français. Oh, you don't speak French.
Oui, tout à fait. En français, c'est
français. That session, I believe, will be recorded, so you'll be able to follow up on it. But there's a lot going on because the decolonizing debate in Francophone Africa is very different. And they're really, there's some peers in Ringo that are really trying to get that going more effectively.
Yeah, I've connected with Jim already. So
there's
that's
also
great.
Luc Lampriere from HelpAge International as well, works a lot in in that region. So
fantastic. Thank you very much.
Follow up with that. Okay, cheers.